Hey you, you're finally awake. Trying to cross the border. "25 minutes of my partner braiding my hair. Totally worth it for a 15-second bit based on a 2-year-old meme based on a 10-year-old video game. And if that's not retro enough for you, before the video is done, I'm also going to reference a 49-year-old video game and a 63-year-old musical. Hi folks, welcome to Glitter Void Gamecraft. My name is Eric, and this week I'm going to be building wagons and the modular bed inserts for them. This is another great versatile piece of small scatter terrain for adding character to the village, or a great playable piece for individual encounters. The ability to swap one insert for the other makes for great options for quests. And honestly, these individual inserts are a great small project for when you're not in the mood for something really involved. But enough of me wagging my tongue about this project. Let's get building. The base to this project is a no-frills wagon. I opted not to include any of the hitch parts, as that would be pretty fragile. The base itself isn't super interesting. The real key is the wagon bed inserts. The plan is to make some boxes that fit perfectly into the bed of the base wagon, and upon that box you could build all sorts of interchangeable parts. Great for customizing your campaign. First up, a cage on a cart. I thought about a closed-up paddy wagon, but it wouldn't be easy to make the inside playable in a way that was worth the effort. An open-air cage is a little more interesting, but I need to make sure I could get minis in and out of the cage. Then comes a canvas-covered wagon. Some good old TP and glue forms the canvas stretched over a skeleton frame. When I originally had this idea, I was thinking of a trader wagon of some sort, but the base wagon was a little too plain for my vision of a flamboyant snake oil salesman. No one wants to buy a miracle elixir from a busted old cart. There's all sorts of options. A pile of hay for an assassin to hide in, or for a secret escape route. Barrels and crates for a shipment the heroes are protecting. Customize it however you need. Playability is always my first concern, especially with small items like this. Like with my buildings, I want to make sure that the bed of the wagon isn't eaten up by the sides. Using dollar store foam core board, I cut a base 3 inches by a little more than 2 inches to allow the sides of the wagon. In standard D&D tabletop scale, this is 10 feet by 15 feet, easily enough space for half a dozen adventurers to hang out in. The first wheels I made were an inch wide, but that felt a little too fantasy go-kart. You can use anything with a round base to trace out the wheels, but since I have this dollar store compass, I use that. The tricky part is to make sure you don't punch through the paper with the spiky end, but you do want a small divot to mark the center. Cutting out the wheels can be done with a sharp blade, but I get nervous making cuts on a small piece using the X-Acto. An alternative is to make a ton of straight cuts along the circle until you have a triconagon. Then I use a file to smooth the surface into a passable circle. Next, I made the axles out of BBQ skewers. Finding the center of each wheel using the divot from the compass, I worked the skewers through. Be sure you rotate the skewers rather than ramming it through, since the foam core isn't that strong. I added a plank and wood grain texture using a mechanical pencil, widening the plank pattern with the lead retracted to make it thicker and clearly different from the grain. The same treatment was applied to all of the exposed wooden surfaces. I made the front and sides of the wagon in the same way. The height of the walls is pretty arbitrary. I had a lot of 1-inch cutoffs that were convenient, so I chose that. I finished the wagon first since it would be easier to build the box inside of the wagon rather than to build the wagon around the box inserts. I was trying to save time and use hot glue so I could get to making the box inserts, but that ended up being a wash. The hot glue, predictably, glooped out onto the bed of the wagon, which caused some issues getting the box inserts to fit tightly. I put the wheels on the axles to measure where to cut, making sure to leave some extra space to create the hubcaps, whatever the part of the axle that goes through the wheel is called. These BBQ skewers were too thick to cut through with scissors, so I just cut into them as much as I could and snapped them off, smoothing the ends with a file. I used tacky glue to attach the axles and the top portion of the wheels directly to the wagon sides. The wheels don't spin, so it's less realistic, but this is the weak point, and I wanted to give it as much support as possible. Naturally, using a lot of glue led to it glooping out everywhere. I cleaned this up as best I could before setting it aside to dry. The base wagon finished, on to the fun part, the inserts. The bed inserts needed to fit in snugly so they looked like a unified piece and didn't fall out easily. The gloops of hot glue that I wasn't able to remove prevented that, so I cut some notches out of the box insert pieces so they would sit flat. Seeing how the pieces fit together, I realized that the end pieces of each box insert should be flush with the end of the wagon. So I cut an amount off of each side piece to make that happen. I inserted a few more foam pieces to keep the frame rigid and then glued the whole thing together. I assembled and pinned the box insert inside the bed of the wagon and let it dry for just a bit before removing it to finish drying. Set a timer, you don't want to come back and find the insert glued into the bed. For the cage cart, I wanted to make sure the supports were very secure. I cut lengths of BBQ skewers and attached them to the inside of the box insert, coming up through the floor. I pushed the sticks into the corners and glooped in a bunch of hot glue to secure it. I had to hold it in place until it was quite cool to keep things from shifting. The floor was made from a piece the same size as the interior of the cart bed. I punched holes where the supports would go, lined them up, covered the contact points with tacky glue, and smushed the whole thing together. At this point, I realized if the whole cage were bars, the captives could just reach through and mess with the driver. So I created a divider to separate the two. I then cut skewers to create the various bars. You can create whatever density of bars you want, but painting a rounded surface like this is pretty obnoxious, so less may be more. Though if your world does contain halflings, you would want to make sure that the density isn't too low. I finally settled on making a hinged door that opened from the sides. I made the door itself just like the cage and added a lock assembly / strike plate area with a small piece of chipboard. This would remain detached until after painting. The door pull was made from a small jewelry circle wrapped in cardstock to simulate a leather strap. Working with pieces this small can be pretty frustrating, which is why I do a lot of the manipulation with tweezers. I made several of these because I wanted to mount a few on the divider wall, something to chain the most fearsome captives to. One final detail, some steps up to the door. The floor of the cage sat about the height of a regular miniature, so they needed a way to get in and out. I made sure the stairs didn't extend past the bottom of the insert, otherwise they'd have too much pressure on them when the insert sat flat, like when it wasn't in use. For the covered wagon, I made the frame with BBQ sticks stuck in at a slight angle to give it a more interesting, less boxy shape. I punched holes in the floor using the same skewers so I could glue it in from the bottom, just like I did with the previous one. I inserted the sticks into the holes and got started gluing. Later I came back and filled both box inserts with more hot glue to add weight, as the relatively tall wagons made out of mostly foam were a bit top-heavy. I wasn't sure how to make a sturdy curved piece across the top, so I went with a simpler option. I cut a skewer a little longer than the width between the vertical post, then notched it in the middle. I carefully broke the skewer, not all the way through, just enough to create an angle. I then dabbed some super glue at the broken point to lock it in at the exact angle. Attaching these skewers together in a frame was harder than expected. The tacky glue wasn't strong enough to hold them in place, as the peaks wanted to rotate downward. I ended up attaching them with super glue for a quicker bond. The tarp for the covered wagon was made similar to the canvas market stalls. I tore off an appropriate sized sheet of TP, folded it over itself to add strength, dipped it in plain water, and squeezed off the excess. I draped it over the frame and bent the edges in a natural looking way. Once I liked how it looked, I drenched it all in regular white glue. And I mean drenched. The water and probably the capillary action of the toilet paper spread the glue out some, but I helped it along with my fingers as I went, further shaping the tarp. I probably went a bit overboard on the glue, as this took more than 12 hours to dry, but the wide areas were sturdy and the edges were sharp, which I trimmed into a more intentional looking shape. I didn't directly paint the tarp, at least not initially. Just a little brown wash does the trick. The TP absorbs it quite well, and it actually makes the whole thing even harder. I took a slightly different approach with some of the base coating this time. On any of the parts that were a very tight fit, like the sides of the bed of the wagon and the sides of the box inserts, I used regular surface primer rather than my usual mix of Mod Podge and black craft paint. The Mod Podge can actually introduce some thickness, especially if it pools anywhere and you don't notice it until it's dried. The lack of protection shouldn't be an issue, as they're all not facing outwards and won't get the most abuse. Everything else got the regular Mod Podge mixture. The paint job was very standard. The wood in the cart and the inserts were all painted the same color, making sure it matched each other. An overbrush of golden brown and a dry brush of fog gray gave it all some texture and light, a real worn wood feel. The bars all got a coat of gunmetal, then I finished it off with the homemade black wash on everything, including the tarp. It was looking a little too see-through, a little too light of a color, and I hadn't even highlighted anything yet. The metal needed some mucking up. Using brown and a terracotta, I did some dry brushing and stippling to create dirt and rust and corrosion. I just kept adding it until it looked good. The plain brown was also used to add some mud and dirt on the steps, as well as to paint the leather on all the door pulls that I totally hadn't forgotten about until this moment. The wood and tarp all got a dry brush of suede to bring the highlights back up. This is where those sharp edges on the TP really start to shine. After a very light silver dry brush on the metallics, it was time to head outside to spray everything with a matte varnish. To make the door open, I tied some loops of thread connecting the door to the cage. If I were to do this again, I would probably either skip the thread entirely or at least supplement it by extending one of the supports of the door frame into the floor just a few millimeters to have a base of rotation. The string by itself is a little finicky and certainly isn't very strong. The final detail, the poles, were installed using super glue, 2 on the back of the divider and 1 on the door itself. And with that last detail, everything just looked kind of bleh. I needed to inject some variation. Stippling some black onto the bars made them look more like a menacing wrought iron with a little bit of the rust showing through. I mixed blue with a dab of black to add stripes on the tarp. I definitely recommend settling on this before you do the washes and highlights. It was a little bit tricky to go back and blend them in with the rest of the tarp. But in the end, it's important to remember that it's just paint and you can always fix mistakes or completely change directions at the last minute. And voila, modular wagons, as well as a 2-wheeled cart I threw together with some pieces from an abandoned bed insert. Other than their use as set dressing and scatter terrain, these are wonderfully versatile pieces for quests. Escorting a dangerous captive, rescuing a wrongly convicted prisoner, or rightly convicted if it's the party rogue. And how many campaigns start with the party escorting a wagon of supplies only to be ambushed by bandits, or goblins, or kobolds, or skeletons, or something. The wagon provides both a home base / objective, as well as cover, and, in a pinch, given a high enough strength check, a sturdy projectile. Hey look, I caulked my wagon and I'm gonna float it across. Uh-oh. Well, assuming you didn't get swept down the river like that poor soul, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a thumbs up, and let me know in the comments any other ideas you have for bed inserts. I'm sure I didn't get them all. If you found anything in the video particularly useful, consider subscribing to the channel or sharing the video with your dungeon master. That all really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Oh, the Wells Fargo wagon is a-comin' down the street. Oh, please don't copyright strike me.